Episode 20. I cannot believe that it has already been 20 weeks of my spiritual fitness grow self project, and this is the time to reflect on another set of episodes. If you hadn't checked it out before, it seems like every 10 episodes I do some reflections, and so I'm going to be reflecting on episodes 11 through 19 in a sequential order. But before I get there, I'd like to offer just some generic reflections to start off with to get about where this podcast is headed. The first thing is that this is the last episode that I will be uploading things to Spotify, and I'm going to focus my efforts solely on YouTube as my preferred platform. It looks like there isn't much traffic or anything happening on Spotify, and I think just the YouTube algorithm gods are more favorable to me. Analytics show that I have traffic on this podcast, so perhaps you're someone who's been suggested this video and you've been clicked in to listen, and I'd love to capture your attention and reward it with some entertainment, but also education, enlightenment, and above all, a roadmap pathway to help you find more success in your resiliency. And that's the big thing about where I am understanding how this podcast is becoming formed and like the target audience, the target subject, which is when I talk about spirituality, this concept to me is something that's very comfortable, something very accessible and understood. And I'm often realizing that I'm like a salesperson trying to pitch the understanding of spirituality in a accessible manner and to undo or dispel the concerns that people have, rightly so, about what spirituality is and what it is not. And yes, that's coming from my own opinion, but that opinion is based off of my practical experience of being a hospital chaplain and working with people. So I think that this podcast is going to move away from the more explicit terms within religion and spirituality and more focused on the broader concepts of what spirituality has to provide, which means I believe that the truly accessible term that communicates the exact same concepts is this idea of intrinsic resiliency. When I say spiritual fitness, people tend to lean towards, oh, this is religious and I'm not religious, or this is spiritual and I'm not spiritual. Yet when I explain, no, it's this intrinsic resiliency that allows you to overcome challenges and propels you to do things that are within line of your values, to get up in the 4:30 in the morning to exercise, to stay at the bedside by your daughter while she's sick, even though there are competing concerns, to sign up for new classes, new education, whatever it is that motivates you to do hard things. This is what I would believe is your spiritual fitness, and it comes from your understanding of your meaning, how you understand life, the worldview and the perceptions, the core foundational beliefs, which in religion we call this theology, and for others you'll call it philosophy. But in the end, it all comes down to what are your core values, that's your meaning, and then purpose, your role, your place in the world. What is it that you do that defines you? Because often when we experience crises, one of the things that becomes the center of our crisis is the challenge to who we think we are, the identity that we have. So when you lose your job, if your role, your purpose in life is your profession, then you're going to experience a spiritual crisis. I say that, but if you're not someone who buys into the idea of spirituality, you're going to push against that. But when I tell you that when you lose your job, you're losing your sense of purpose in life, immediately you're going to say, yes, you're right, I feel lost without my job. Not to mention, your sense of purpose comes from your sense of self-worth. So where do you find value in yourself and what defines that value? religion is full of explaining where that value comes from, whether it's an idea that you are a, quote, child of God, or you are considered a chosen person, maybe even as far as something that you're able to work up and build and earn your reputation and standing within God's eyes. But beyond that, within just daily lives, the role of father, the role of provider, the role of son, the role of brother, the role of friend are all things that have those spiritual elements built into them that can be addressed without having to go into the theology or even the weird ushy-gushy spiritual side of things. And we can still get to the same destination as this intrinsic resiliency that allows us to dig deep within ourselves and realize that our self-worth is independent, or should be independent, completely detached from all external factors. The more detached our self-worth becomes, the more resilient we are. Example being, you see a doctor who's doing something that is out of practice. He's performing an operation and he's not wearing gloves on. If you see yourself as your role is, he is above me, I'm just a tech, I'm just a nurse, I'm just a chaplain, and it's not my job to say something, then you're not going to say something. However, if you see your role as based off your values, my values are, I am someone who is a provider. I prefer service. Justice is important to me. Speaking up is sort of these concepts that then transcend the actual role, so that even if I were to be fired, or even if I were to experience a negative reaction, I would be living into my role by saying, hey, doc, you forgot your gloves, even though the internal resistance might be there. The person who can step up and speak up, despite a challenge to roles or a power differential, has spiritual fitness, i.e., they have intrinsic resiliency. So I'm going to be using this term much more. Oh, and then the third idea, so you've got meaning and you've got purpose, and then belonging, your sense of community. How are you connected with people, with the world, with your, quote, neighborhood in life? So if your purpose in life is your intrinsic understanding of independent, detached self-worth, then your community is your relationship to others on the external side of things. Who do you belong to? Who do you identify with? Once again, religion offers a very clear pathway. You know, you're a Christian, you're a Jew, you're a Muslim, you're a Hindu, you're a Buddhist, you're a Taoist, you're a Northeastern Viking, whatever it is, Norwegian Viking. The same concepts allows you to easily and immediately access that community. And we see here within the realm of postmodernism, where you can see also how that sense of community can be equally healthy as it is equally toxic, where folks then turn to immutable characteristics that define themselves, and then they separate themselves from society in very vicious and, again, detrimental ways to not only themselves but to others. When we define ourselves based on who we are not, and then we live a world in which we navigate those things on a constant basis, this is where we experience a lack of resiliency, because, well, if I don't have my people, or my people don't see me, then who am I? In other words, when we mix up the idea of purpose with community, we mess up the wires, and this is what causes a lot of suffering internally. So the positive aspect of community, spiritually religious or resilient speaking, is an understanding of having people where you're able to grow, having a place where you can turn to for help, having a place where you can provide and you can invest in. So who are the people who pour into you and that you pour into them, and experience this mutual reciprocity of giving and receiving? This is what true connection is. And above all, it's a place where your detached, independent self-worth is able to thrive versus be squashed. So this is intrinsic resiliency. This is spiritual fitness. Whatever terms you need to use in order to feel comfortable about it, that's what I say is where we're going to be headed. And now we're going to break down these episodes because this is how we got there. Episode 11, I talk with Coach, and I call it True Bravery. And Coach tells a story about his recovery from his experience in the military when he was serving in the Army at the real height of the Afghanistan and Iraq war. In his experience, he says how it was his second deployment that really opened up his eyes to what it is that he loves most in life, where he finds connection, where he finds purpose. And then when he came home, it was all back to bad habits. His intrinsic resiliency at that point was not as strengthened, and realized that his environment was having a huge impact on him. I wonder if it was more of an effect of a poor community, a poor sense of belonging, that then caused him to fall into the spiral that led to addiction. Nevertheless, Coach's sense of purpose, sense of meaning, was able to pull himself out of it by his own merit and get to the point where he is sober. He's a happy father of 2 kids, working stable, and on an incredible path of success, simply because he reoriented his intrinsic resiliency, spiritual fitness, to get to a place of overcoming one of life's most difficult and universal problems, which is addiction. If anyone here listening has thought to themselves that they don't understand addiction, or maybe addiction is something that seems more distant because I'm not an alcoholic, I would challenge you to say that addiction is less about these big term labels and more about, do you have a relationship with a substance that is unhealthy for you? Because that relationship is the addiction. When we constantly turn to a toxic substance to do something for instant gratification rather than endure the discomfort of the moment in order to experience long-term or delayed gratification. Figuring out this switch to say this too shall pass is the key to overcoming any toxic relationship, which is the nature of addiction. Speaking of nature, episode 12 was with my friend Patrick, and he talked about his experience of learning archery and hunting with it, and how that had become like his place of self-care and personal internal development, reflecting on how just the journey of the hunt itself, stalking your prey, climbing up in a tree and waiting for hours for just the possibility of having your target come into your sights, and then making the decision to pull back that bow, aim, and release it, and take the chance to take your shot. Patrick learned a lot of life lessons, and as he is growing in his development, seems to be applying those even to his outside life. And it also seemed to be a popular episode too, with a good amount of folks who engaged with it. People liked Patrick's story. I did too. 13 is with Walker, who is a lawyer and also a longtime friend. And he shared his story about going to law school and also his experience as a lawyer. The intrinsic resiliency, spiritual fitness involved in being a lawyer and going to law school for him was a result of his understanding of purpose and meaning in life. But those two came from his strong sense of belonging, as he has been blessed with a very healthy family. That healthy family enabled him to develop this sense of love in giving and serving others. And me knowing him personally, I can say that is definitely true. So in Walker's story, as a lawyer, serving the needs of others and defending them and advocating for them are just expressions of his intrinsic resiliency in finding a profession that allows him to express his meaning and purpose in life. And I believe that if he were ever to lose his job, heaven forbid, that it would be easy for him to recover emotionally, spiritually, if so long as he's able to find something that also gives him that sense of meaning and purpose. He doesn't have to be a lawyer and also to love people, to serve the needs of others, or to be an advocate. And that's one of the hallmarks of being in a healthy place, in a healthy relationship with your job. It's your job. It's not that your job defines you. It's your job that enables you to be you. Episode 14 is with Kevin, and Kevin had told me I had known before we recorded that Kevin had gone on this epic journey to Africa, and I was dying to learn about it. And this podcast gave me the opportunity to ask him those questions. The funny thing is that we couldn't even get off the tarmac story before we started unpacking some really cool things. Kevin shared how his ability to sit patiently and deal with the delays in his flight and his trip to Africa that he had spent a lot of money on and had spent a lot of time on and was making a lot of sacrifices to be there, how this delay in his travels that caused him to miss his flight, have to book a hotel, deal with the TSA because he's traveling with guns and all of that, done in a way in which he empathized with all the people around him. He realized that it wasn't any one particular person's fault, that it wasn't the baggage check person's fault that the bags weren't ready. It wasn't the TSA person's fault that they were going through all these certain checks and balances. And it wasn't the hotel's fault that things were going to be overpriced and charged. It was just the way things are, and people are doing the best that they can with what they have. He learned that from his father, which goes back to the power of a healthy sense of belonging coming from a healthy family. But more above that, you don't have to have the healthy family to have healthy relationships. And his upbringing helped him learn that, but also his way of life, of purpose and role and meaning is helped him get there. There's plenty of people who grow up in the same household who have different outcomes. They can be exposed to the same values, but still choose a different path. It's the nature versus nurture. You're born with a certain personality trait, and your environment brings those up. Some people take to it, some don't. But in the end, we are ultimately responsible for how we go about using the experiences life gives us. Travis in episode 15 is literally in the moment of dealing with his newborn child's medical crisis. He talked about how he is handling things right here, right now. If you ever want to hear what it is to be like, what it's like to be a parent in the moment of a medical crisis for your newborn child, Travis is the story. He gives a real raw, unfiltered, honest account of how he is doing and turns to show how his intrinsic resiliency is enabling him to navigate this storm. In a previous episode with my friend Jared, he talked about how we have, build a bigger boat, and your boat that you have represents your intrinsic resiliency. And Travis is literally in the boat right now and in the storm. Listen to that to just connect and see maybe how you would fare if you could imagine yourself in that position. 16 is with Deacon Tom, and we met at a family event for retirement for my uncle-in-law, and he and I made a great connection. I asked him to be part of the podcast, and I was very grateful when he obliged me. Tom describes in great detail the understanding of spiritual fitness or intrinsic resiliency from the Catholic perspective, going into explaining how the Catholic Church views these aspects of the purpose of attending worship, the purpose of spiritual disciplines, and the real power of having certain habits that sort of that reset and realign your life. Religion offers wonderful things when it comes to these sets of practices that can reorient or bring us back down to our core values, our core sense of self-worth, and our core sense of community. Often when a tragedy or a crisis strikes, we can get tossed up into the emotionality of things and lose or forget or neglect our sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging, and then take up and take on reactivity's anxiety. And then before we know it, we're just going back to our animalistic tendencies and becoming temperamental, becoming overwhelmed, and all these negative reactions that then only increase our suffering in this situation. Spiritual fitness, intrinsic resiliency, doesn't promise to be a life free of pain. In fact, pain is guaranteed in life. Tragedy will happen. We just don't know when and where or how. So it's better to be prepared to be able to handle that, so that in the midst of the tragedy, like in Travis's situation, in the midst of the storm, we can still keep our hands on the wheel and navigate it versus succumbing to the waves and hiding under deck. This moves into episode 17 with my coworker Jason, and it is his story of becoming a member of the Make-A-Wish Foundation. It's a popular episode, and I think it's reasonably so, because there are plenty of people who are interested in what this has to do, and perhaps there are others who are either connected with the organization in one way or another. Jason describes from start to finish what it was like for him and his wife to have a child go from receiving a terminal illness or terminal diagnosis, coping with it, getting through 100 days in the hospital, and then coming to a point where the child was discharged, and then going to Disney World. It was a touching story, and for him and his experience, it's a place where he opens up about just how important having intrinsic resiliency is. Because I don't believe from what he shared, he would have been able to handle the things that he did in the way that he did if he did not have that deeper sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging. Episode 18 is with Trevin, a journalist who I met on a fellowship, and we talk about this understanding of hope. The majority of the episode focuses on the realm of meaning, how we understand life around us and interpret these events based on our core foundational beliefs. And Trevin's core belief is that something good is going to come out of this, even if I don't know what, and especially if it's so dark and so murky, then it's what he holds on to continue to push and to be resilient. He experienced this first when he moved back from California and to make the jump into the New York City life, which I think is a cultural phenomenon that's well known, the idea of trying to make it in New York City. And make it, he did, based off of this sheer belief of like, we're going to figure this out, we're going to do this and make it work. And that belief, despite setbacks and challenges, got him to where he is today. Ironically enough, this podcast had to be rescheduled. And as a result of that, we were able to catch him on the back end of a tragic event that had just occurred a few days earlier, in which he had been fired and lost his job. And we were talking about how he was navigating that experience and his plan forward. And this is why he kept reiterating this idea of, I don't know what good will come from this, but I do believe that there is something else that I'm going to be able to take from this that's going to make me better. When you apply that concept to tragic things like pediatric cancer, losing a loved one in an untimely manner, or name some grotesque, terrible event, it can be very difficult and also very horrible to hear. Don't ever tell someone, hey, something good's going to come from this because your child died. Just take that from me. It doesn't work. But after the grief process stages of shock, denial, and bargaining, and anger, all those pass, then eventually that destination of acceptance and new normal is described as, I got something beneficial out of that, even though I lost something that I didn't want to lose. And that's a very healthy place to look. And then my last episode was with Josh and his experience in finding Tai Chi, and the road from having physical fitness be a place where he finds meaning and purpose and belonging, to then realizing that it was becoming his only sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging, and eventually turned into a toxic relationship that got him to a point where he experienced an injury where he could no longer do those things. But more than that, he experienced life changes that allowed him to reorient his sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging to a healthier and more mature place of life. So is it chicken? Is it egg? I would say it depends. And in his situation, it is, I believe, the chicken. He started off with the physical fitness, and then being in the military, realizing that the culture of the Marines was not in line with his deep sense of meaning, which is like you help the person in front of you no matter who they are, pushed him to then cease his original long-time prospect of being a 20-year guy, and then finding the helping profession, becoming a father in the midst of that, and using all of his discipline that he learned from physical fitness and channeled it into living into that value of helping people and serving others in a way that's sustainable. And also taking off the mask that our physical fitness, literal physical fitness, defines our self-worth, and realizing that his place of self-acceptance and finding comfort in that place is truly a sustainable way to live. So it doesn't matter how big your muscles are, how big you are. In the end, if you don't love yourself, it's never going to be enough. But for him, learning that he can love his body and do what he can with that body that he was given allows him to find that right place of comfort. And that is the sweet spot. There you go. That is the last 9 episodes. 20 weeks of this. We're over 6 months in, and I've got another 80 episodes to go, but we're thinking about this 10 episodes at a time. What's coming up in the future? The big thing is that I've ran through all the people who can say yes to my podcast because I know them personally, and they have a desire to invest in the things that I love, and I would do the same thing for them if they were ever to ask, and be delighted to do so. So I've gone through those rings of friends, and there's still a few friends out there who have expressed interest in helping out, or I haven't yet contacted, and I've got some other mentors that I can reach out to as well. But the one episode that's coming up next is what I believe is the future of my podcast, and it's going to be the less interpersonal relationship side of things and more about the true study of intrinsic resiliency from people who are doing it in everyday life. So this could be professions, this could be organizations, but in the end, it's about the people in those positions and what they do. So I may not be able to post as often, but I believe that the quality of my content is only going to improve with time. Thinking about what the first episode was to where we are now, lots of changes have happened, and I keep thinking about what ways I can mold and shape this podcast to be more than just a personal project and really maybe create a community around this. That takes time, that takes a level of humility, and perhaps even realizing that this may not be the way to go. So with that, this next set of 10 is going to be a real turning point in this podcast, and I think some necessary changes are going to be made, and I'm excited to see where this turns. And that's it. I appreciate you listening and tuning into this podcast. If you listen to it all the way through, I love it, and I'd love to hear your comments and suggestions. If there are people that you think should be on this show, or you yourself would love to share your story of intrinsic resiliency and things that you've overcome, people love a good story, and I am open to whatever that might be. No matter what, wherever you go, wherever you are, never forget that your self-worth should not be defined by others, but defined by yourself. And within that, find your community from people who challenge you to be a better person and love you for who you are inherently, not by what you say or do. And your meaning and how you understand the world to come from a place that allows you to express empathy for others, to also love yourself, and to be able to endure and overcome difficult challenges. Intrinsic resiliency, spiritual fitness, the soldier side of these things. That's where we're headed. Thanks so much for listening, and tune in next week for another great episode of the Grow Self Spiritual Fitness Podcast. Okay, bye.